I'm going to look at two areas this morning. I'm going to do a case study. There's been a recent breach which has put cybersecurity back at the top of the agenda, and so we're going to quickly go through what happened there and some of the lessons can be learned. And then let's go through 5 steps that pension schemes or companies can take to start implementing a cybersecurity framework. So the breach, going to use a case study, probably not a surprise, it's the Capita breach. So back in March, probably most people are aware, Capita had a breach. Going to briefly go through what happened as a timeline. Throughout this is not to sort of pull Capita up and say that they are different in what happened. Unfortunately, all the regulators will tell you this is a when this happens, not an if. So we all have to be prepared for these sort of breaches, and there's been a number of companies over the past couple of months. BBC, British Airways, Boots, all the Bs have also had breaches. And therefore, this is usually just to what can we learn and what can we do better next time. So on the 22nd of March, the breach actually happened. And then 9 days later, 31st of March, Capita started letting clients know we've had some system problems. Nothing to see here, not a cybersecurity incident, everything's fine. And systems are pretty much back up and running. On the 3rd of April, they released a statement to say, well, it was a cyber incident, but no data has been lost, everything's fine, nothing to see here. On the 8th of April, the Blackbuster ransomware gang, who are a professional ransomware gang based out of Russia, put data online, personal data that they said they had taken from Capita servers. And then finally, on the 20th of April, Capita notified a number of the large pension schemes across the UK, as well as other organisations, that their data had been stolen. The consequences of this, about 4% of Capita's infrastructure, and Capita, a huge company, were compromised as a result of this. I did this about a week ago, and it was £15 million to correct. It's now about £20 million to put this right. 90 organisations at that point had reported breaches. I think the number's probably far higher today. And the pensions regulators being in contact with over 300 pension schemes to see if they have been impacted. I know a number of our schemes have. And probably more importantly, thousands, tens of thousands, probably hundreds of thousands of people across the UK, their data has been stolen, that is now on the dark web, and they are a target for fraud, probably for the next couple of years. So what can we learn from this? I think one of the first things to take away is actually technically the incident was handled very well, and technically I mean from an IT perspective. A huge number of systems affected, 9 days to get everything sort of back up and running and close to business as usual is actually pretty good. So the technical side of the incident management was handled quite well. However, the overall incident management, the nothing happened, nothing to see here, failed to meet regulatory requirements. Now, you're all hopefully aware of your obligations as either trustees or employers around data protection, that you have 72 hours to notify the ICO if you have a breach. And the fact that they withheld this information has meant that it's at least a month, in our experience actually far longer than that, before people actually know their data has been lost. And therefore those individuals can't take the steps necessary to look after themselves. So it does highlight the preparation for how you manage an incident. How are you going to communicate with your affected employees, members, contractors, clients? It's really key. And being prepared for this, having a plan, so that when it happens, and I'm afraid it is when it happens, you know what you're doing and you know how to respond in order to get the best outcome for your members. It's a really good case study to run yourselves. We recommend you do desktop exercises. You sit down and say, okay, if this was us and we received a notification on the 31st of April or 30th of April to say, this is what's happened, and there's nothing to see here, what would you have done? What should you have done next time? When I go to detail on incident management plans, I usually say this to trustees and say, well, you've got to have one. You probably did it during GDPR. And I say, and there's usually a few blank faces. Think, yeah, I can remember that, but I've got no idea what it was. Haven't looked at it since 2018. One of the things you'll find is when these things happen to your scheme, your company, they're horrendous. And you really want to have had some experience of running through them first before you're doing it live. So taking that, and the regulation has for a long time been saying you need to do more with regards to security. GDPR put some requirements around information security. Pensions regulator released guidance on what you should be doing back in 2018, and it's likely the general code is going to also put more emphasis on this area. And so what we're going to go through now is the sort of 5 areas. This is not a hugely onerous task to get something in place. Obviously, this is the start. There's always more you can do, but 5 areas that should set you up well with a good basic cybersecurity framework. So the first thing the regulator says you have to do is risk assessment. And this risk assessment is the same as your investment risk assessment and all these risks you'll have already on your risk register. And the way the regulator says you start with this is the first thing to do is identify what on earth are my information assets. It's like your investment assets, but what are your information assets? And keep it quite simple. So this is typically your member records, your employee records, your payroll records. You've got a different provider, laptops and the like. And I like to at this point bring in things like physical files if you are transporting physical paper files around, because we'll look later. So the ICO published stats on this, and there's still far more breaches that are not cybersecurity related than are cybersecurity related. Once you understand what your information assets are, you can then do your risk assessment. The regulator says you should risk assess against loss, damage, and disruption. In the information security world, we call this confidentiality, integrity, and availability risks. Now, confidentiality risk is the one we're probably all familiar of. And we typically think of the hacker in the bedroom who breaks into the network and steals your data. The capital breach was a confidentiality breach. Somebody who's not supposed to have access to the data got access to the data. But the regulator says it's not just that risk, the one we all think about as cybersecurity. There are 2 other risks. There's your integrity risk. This is that your information gets damaged. So it could be a member portal where somebody manages to change the data of members. They can't access the data, but they've managed to change it in some way. So they've managed to change bank account details or address details or something like that. The capital breach was also an integrity breach because there was ransomware deployed and they hadn't lost the data and given some of the data to anybody, but they couldn't access it anymore because it was locked out. Finally, the availability breach is full terms availability at the point of need. So this is where you look at your systems. What would happen if your systems weren't available? And payroll's usually the one, or talk to pension schemes around this one. What happens when you have that capital incident and it's the day before you're supposed to pay the payroll? What is your backup plan for that scenario? So when you are looking at your risk, you don't just focus on that, oh no, somebody's got our data risk. There are other risks. And then you should put into place a cybersecurity policy. Now, I'm not a fan of policy for policy's sake, but this is the one policy that's a genuinely useful document. Because most trustee boards don't have cybersecurity expertise on site, and most companies don't have access to cybersecurity knowledge, what a policy can allow you to do is at a very high level set out the controls you expect. And it will say things like, we expect an industry standard level of encryption. So just simple, high-level controls across these sort of areas, and most of these are from the PASA guidance, infrastructure, penetration tested, business continuity, and the like. And there's a couple that we've thrown in as well. And you can take this document and you can use it internally and you can use it with your suppliers and get them to self-assess against that policy and identify any weaknesses. And it's not a document to beat them over the head with, it's so that the trustees get, well, when you're not penetration testing the website, okay, that's something we really need you to do. And it allows you to have that conversation, keeping it very high level, very simple, so especially if you don't have the ability to call in cybersecurity expertise. When I do this training with trustee boards, if you do nothing else, make sure you're on top of your suppliers. If you do nothing else with cybersecurity, this is the one area you need to be all over. The Capita breach was a supply chain breach. A month later, we had the Move It breach. The BBC, the British Airways breach was a supply chain breach. You probably remember British Airways back in 2019. A lot of credit card information was stolen, was a supply chain breach. So managing your suppliers, especially when that's probably where a lot of your data sits, is incredibly important. And how do you do this? Well, the first thing you should be doing is categorizing your suppliers. And you can go to the nth degree on this, but I'd recommend you keep it quite straightforward, that you have critical suppliers and regular suppliers. Because really you should be focusing all your time, all your effort where you have risk. And that will be in your critical suppliers. And they will be the suppliers who can materially impact that confidentiality, integrity, and availability of your systems and your data. Once you've categorized them, you know who your critical suppliers are. There are some simple things you can do if you don't have expertise on hand to look at it. Accreditations are a good start. The typical accreditations you would look for in this space would be ISO 27001, which sets out a firm has an information security management system that's been externally accredited by somebody who knows what they're on about. And it's a good thing to look out for. There's also Cybersecurity Essentials, which is a government-backed scheme where they will come in and look at things like antivirus and the like. And in the pensions world, you've got the AAF accreditation, 0120, which is primarily administration qualification, but there is sort of 2/3 admin, about 1/3 IT. So it could be another good thing to have a quick look at a firm's AAF report, and it can just highlight, are there any questions that you should be asking of your suppliers? Making sure your contracts are fit for purpose. And I know there's a number of pension schemes across the country who are looking at their contracts in terms of what did they say Capita could keep and couldn't keep. What did they say about requirements to notify? Now, employers, trustees as data controllers, they have a legal requirement to notify. And it's that 72-hour window. But that's not the same for processors. So your contract should have some stipulation in there in terms of when you expect people to notify and should set out a time frame for that. Can issue questionnaires. You can get templates of these online. The only, leave this kind of to the end, this is where you ask them to rate how all the different firewalls they've got and all of these sort of things, but they can be quite technical, and if you're not going to do anything with it, then it is not phenomenally useful, but it can be good for keeping an audit trail of what they said they had should something go wrong. And the final point on this, a pension regulator hammers this home as well, is that you can't just do it once and forget it. And it's the same with the risk assessment. Cybersecurity risk changes all the time. Unfortunately, you can't just do your suppliers, then walk away. And COVID was a good example of this, where you could have assessed your supplier in January 2020, and great, everything's fit for purpose. But in April 2020, chances are they were working in a completely different manner, accessing data in a completely different manner. And is it still appropriate? And what should you do? Really what trustee boards and employees should be doing of their suppliers is just asking the questions. What are you doing during this period to keep our data safe? And really that is your biggest strength, is to be asking the right questions when you need to. We talked a bit already about incident response plans. And say one of the anecdotes that goes around in IT is there's only two types of organizations, those that know they've been breached and those that don't know they've been breached. PASA came out with guidance that said you have to be planning for when this happens, not if. And it's not a nice thing to think about, but you do. And so you should have an incident response plan. I would really recommend you do one of these desktop exercises, the cyber warfare gaming that you can do, where you go through it, you run it, you ask yourself questions about how do we report to the ICO? You know we've got 72 hours to do it, but how do you actually do it? What does that look like? And it's a really good idea to have done that in a nice, safe environment before you have to do it for the first time. And it's really a good thing to go and look at, because it will help you understand what sort of questions you need to be asking of a Capita when this happens, because you have to give information to the ICO. And your typical incident plan, you would involve appropriately get help, whether that's the sponsors, IT team, or anybody else. Get somebody who's got IT knowledge in straight away to help you. Invest in containment, establishing the impacts, you can make your data protection call. But obviously this is idealized. You have 72 hours from the point you suspect there's been a breach. You don't have to know there's been a breach, you just have to suspect there's been a breach. It's not working hours, it's actual hours, which is why having these plans and having tested them and knowing where they are is such a good idea. And before I get to number 5, what I'm just quickly cover is how did the capital breach actually occur? Well, we don't know for definite because they haven't published this out, but we do know how the Black Bastard gang work, and it's phishing, phishing, and more phishing. So almost certainly it was a phishing email. I had the pleasure of talking to KPMG's incident response team, so they get called in when these sort of things happen to come and help organizations. And I asked them the question, well, what do you deal with day in, day out? I say, email, 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 email. And in the course where I do try and scare you, I do also try and convince you that emails are evil. It'd make my life so much easier if you could just turn them off. But almost certainly what happened was the Capital were targeted by a professional gang. They sent them a phishing email, an employee clicked it, and £20 million later, we are where we are today. And that will have downloaded some ransomware, ran across the systems. As I mentioned earlier, the ICO report breaches. So in the last quarter of 22-23, there were over 8,000 breaches reported, and you get all this information online. It's really quite interesting if you're that way inclined. And of those breaches, I reckon about just over 80% of them had email as the root cause. It's not just phishing, that's people accidentally emailing data out, but email is a huge issue. And over 85% of them likely involved human error on behalf of somebody in the organization who had legitimate access to the data. So we talk about, I was having a conversation earlier about the teenager breaking into the bedroom, and that does happen. There are organizations, but the majority of breaches happen by the people who actually were supposed to have access to the data in the first place. They clicked the email, they sent something out accidentally, they had a rubbish password, and the like. So we come to number 5 on my thing you need to do, which is training. You are the best and last line of defense. When that phishing email arrives in, that's gone through a number of IT controls to get to you, which have all failed, and then you are that last line of defense. So you should be getting training and what are your main threats, knowing where the hell your policies are and your procedures are, and good cybersecurity hygiene, things like good passwords and the like. So that is how you go about doing this. Risk understanding your risk. Get a policy in place. There are templates online. It's a really useful document. Make sure you're looking after your suppliers if you do nothing else. I get loads of these questionnaires, bane of my life, but they are a useful thing to do. Make sure you have an incident management plan, because it is highly likely that everybody in this room will have experience of a cybersecurity attack in the future, unfortunately, and make sure your own training is up to date. That is me, unless there are any questions.
So you estimate the cost of putting the capital breach right at 20 million. That is enough to sink a lot of firms that are kind of critical to the pensions industry. It can be like smaller administrators and things like that. Is it possible for firms to get insurance against these types of risks, or do you expect it to take a number of firms?
I think yes, it is. So we ourselves have a cyber liability policy. I think the insurance industry is a little bit behind. I think it's not priced correctly at the moment, and there will be an adjustment in the future, because you can get millions of pounds worth of cover on cyber liability relatively, in the grand scheme, quite cheaply at the moment. So it's definitely something organisations should look at. But I don't think the insurance industry quite are on top of this. One email clicked, £20 million. And that doesn't include any regulatory fines that they could be issued with. This is just managing this. And obviously that's also not reputational risk either. That's just the cost of dealing with this incident, putting it right. Now, there's far more cost in there. But yes, there are policies you can get, like the KPMG one I've talked about, that they will come in and they will help you, and it could be something definitely to look at. And at the moment, it's not phenomenally expensive, but I suspect that will change.
We insure against cyber, and the due diligence insurance company that you've got to have done all that. You can't just put an insurance policy in instead of doing the hard yards.
Yeah, it does. Yeah, it does surprise me at the moment how cost effective it is.
Chris, thank you for that. Given the COVID has expedited the work anytime, anywhere sort of culture, do you think there needs to be a reset, a rethink how critical information and where critical information is accessed?
Well, I would hope it's been done. But I think it's a valid point. It comes back to this supplier assessment about the ever-changing landscape. The risk will have materially changed. In fact, there was a breach impacting another a third-party administrator around exactly that, remote access to system during. So we've got real experience where that has occurred, and ultimately, yes. The more holes you put in your defences in order to let people in, the more risk. However, that said, yeah, that's only one small part of it. You know, we tend to focus a lot on perimeter defences, as we call it. You try and build this wall of defence so nobody can get in. But then quite often what happens is there's very little behind it. It's just your users, and you just hope that they've got the training and they don't click the link. So it does change the risk profile. But a lot of organisations should be on top of this. Things like two-factor, which you're probably all completely sick to death of, but is a really useful thing to have in all of these things. But it is possible to secure remote working. And say, and the majority of breaches are not breaking in remotely. The Move It one was one where hackers were able to actually get into your systems. Nobody had to do anything. Capita was the other. So.
I was just going to, I don't know, you might not know the answer, but I'm just going to make an assumption that, whilst the Capita breach came to light on the 22nd of March, presumably the attackers were in and lurking all before that.
I mean, so the 22nd of March, Capita stated that's when the attack happened, and that's when things actually started. But you're right, there are breaches where attackers are in systems for 6 months before. And they can be horrendous because what they'll do is get in the system, spend 6 months in the system, locking you out of your backups and all of those things, so that when the attack lands, you're then quite royally in a problem, let's say. So these things do happen. We know that, that's when the breach started. It is entirely plausible. Well, that's when the ransomware started, but they were able to steal data. So it wouldn't surprise me, A, if it happen earlier to that, and B, if we never find out whether it did or not. Because firms don't tend...
The trustees are using Capita as administrators. Mm-hmm. They've got December year end and having to make an assessment of their accounts. They're signing their accounts at the moment as to whether they've got a liability.
Well, one of the problems we're having, particularly around this, is that so they might have told pension schemes on the 20th of April, but on a number of schemes where we're working on it, we still don't have data about who's affected. So you can't. So all these members are out there completely unaware that their data may have been compromised because the trustees don't know.
I had one where the employer was an in-house administrated scheme. The employer got breached, but they got locked out of the pension administration system. So they couldn't even notify pensioners that they took concern because they had no means of tracing it.
Yeah. And that's one of the things that comes out when you do the cyber warfare testing is how would you actually communicate with your members? What is that channel? If,
Well, then you finish up putting Experian credit check coverage in place.
Yes, they do. But ultimately, nothing can now ultimately stop it. The data's been breached. Those members are at enhanced risk for fraud. That data is out there. Experian can help, may raise awareness, but once the breach occurs, that's it. That data is out there and available to people to use for fraud purposes.
Just two observations on that, Chris. First one is around TPR, and people shouldn't forget to notify TPR where relevant. The second one is around the insurance piece. There's a great risk that people will get a false sense of security from having insurance around this. I think you should assume your insurance will not pay out. And that sounds a bit stark, but the reason I would make that assumption if I were a trustee is because the insurance companies will always have a clause in their contract which says that if it's the act, or they believe it's the act of a national actor, be it Russia, China, or whomever, then they will not pay out. So all they've got to do is to say, no, we believe this was a nation state that did this, or was nation state backed, and they don't have to pay out. You would then have to prove that the act was from a nation state, and you can imagine for most trustees, that's going to be quite a hurdle to surmount.
Yes, very valid point.
And paying a ransom is illegal as well.
Absolutely, absolutely illegal. Nobody does it. Allegedly.
Capital won't answer that question.
No.
Thank you, everybody.